Okay, hi, welcome to the Big Shift webinar on multilateral development banks and a Paris-aligned just recovery. My name is Vibeka Mair, and I'll be moderating this webinar. I'm just going to set a few ground rules before the webinar starts. So we'll have questions at the end. But people can type questions into the Q&A box, which you'll just see below your screen. It's separate to the chat box as we go along. And panelists can also answer questions in here if they like as well. We'll ask audience members to keep their videos off, except when they ask questions. I can unmute people to ask a question. But apart from that, we'll be keeping audience members on mute. And also, this webinar is going to be recorded as well. So I'll just explain a bit about myself. My name is Vibeka Mair, and I work for an organisation called Responsible Investor. We're an events and media company which covers the topic of responsible investment. And I just want to mention on the 15th to 19th of June, we'll be holding a week-long digital event focused on the topic of sustainable finance, which may be of interest to audience members. So if you go to www.responsible-investor.com, you'll see more details on that. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie Richmond, who's going to explain a bit about the Big Shift, who's organised this webinar. Thank you. Sophie?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just going to give a brief introduction to what is the Big Shift Global for those who maybe have heard of it but don't exactly know what we do, or for those who it's a new name. So the coalition was started in 2017. We've got more than 40 CSO members from the global north and south. We're calling on the MDBs to shift their money out of fossil fuels and into renewable energy to benefit the most vulnerable and remote communities. We believe that public money is critical in leading the way for others to follow. Making this shift from fossil fuels to renewables would set a gold standard for other public development banks and financial institutions to aspire to. And we also think that MDBs must show their commitment to having signed up to the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. We have three key asks, which are no further financing of fossil fuels, and as part of this, development banks should be implementing managed decline and just transition, particularly given their role as key in sustainable development in countries in the global south. Secondly, that investment should be made into renewable energy and energy efficiency. And finally, that they should be providing clean energy access, all, especially the most vulnerable. And all of this should be done in a transparent way. The public should know how public funds are spent. We are different kinds of organisations. Some are think tanks, some are environmental charities, in international development organisations, and many have different geographical focuses. So some work on all of the multilateral development banks, others just work in specific regions. But we come together under the Big Shift umbrella for public campaigning, including petitions to the banks, internal and external advocacy, research, recommendations to bank policies, exposés where banks are still funding fossil fuels, mobilisations, obviously where circumstances allow, and sharing intel among members. At the moment, some of our current focuses are on targeting specific MDBs in a race to the top to meet the standards set by the European Investment Bank. We've recently supported campaigns on the Africa Development Bank. Also pushing Paris alignment and a just recovery, as this webinar demonstrates, and also pushing the MDBs in terms of their own Paris alignment and advocacy towards the MDBs Paris Alignment Working Group. So those are some of the key things. It's a very quick overview. If you want to find out more, then visit the Big Shift website or follow us on social media. Or if you've got any specific questions or you're interested in becoming a member at the end of this webinar, then please contact me at srichmond@climatenetwork.org. Thanks very much.
Oh, it looks like you might be on mute.
Thank you, Bronwen.
No worries.
Thanks, Sophie. I didn't mention at the beginning of my presentation that I'm quite new to this topic. I usually cover private finance, and I've done some research into public finance in this topic, and I was quite shocked to see that the World Bank, I think over the past 5 years, has spent 12 billion or invested 12 billion in fossil fuels compared to just 5 billion for renewable energy. So there's still quite a big way to go, it sounds like. So we've got 4 great panelists who are going to chew through this issue. First of all, I'd like to introduce Bronwen Tucker, who's an analyst at Oil Change International. Her focus is on shifting public finance and subsidies towards a fair and 100% renewable future as part of the organisation's Stop Funding Fossils programme. Thank you, Bronwen.
Thanks so much. I'm just gonna take over here and share my screen, which is always a little bit scary, but it seems to be working fine usually. Okay, great. But yeah, so basically I'm gonna start just by giving a little bit of an overview of where some of the finance for energy from the MDBs is at right now. And so most of this data is from a report that was released yesterday, so very hot off the presses. And I'll also try to give a bit of an overview of what some of the MDB responses to COVID-19 have been so far in terms of how they might impact energy finance, although obviously there's many other dimensions that are really critical right now for MDB's response in terms of like the very immediate needs, some of which are climate related and some of which aren't. But just to start with the data, the report from yesterday, which I'll share the link to in the chat, looked at not just MDBs, but also export credit agencies and development finance institutions. And so you can see the kind of how the MDB finance for energy stacks up relative to the other kind of big public finance institutions in the same sphere. So generally we find that like it fluctuates from period to period, but in the past few years it has been a kind of even third roughly. And generally with MDBs, their finance is even more, there's more concessional components to it, there's more grant components to it than for the export credit agencies or even other DFIs. And so in terms of public finance having an impact, it's being able to crowd in, like the impact it has on private finance in terms of crowding in, and also just the yeah, just the overall impact on the energy landscape is a little bit bigger per dollar for MDBs than for the other institutions in this category. This kind of the headline finding from the report, again, this one includes all three of those kinds of institutions. And basically, this 77 billion was essentially unchanged since the last time we did this study from 2013 to 2015, which is a big problem. We know that the science says we cannot afford any new finance for fossil fuels if we're going to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. But digging in on MDBs specifically, this is how the finance broke down, and this is for kind of the 9 major MDBs. Should have put the list on this slide, but I'll show in a second which ones in full, but it's the 9 major ones who have made the commitment to Paris alignment. And so, yeah, we can see kind of between these 2 time periods, a little bit of progress in terms of clean energy, but overall not what we would be hoping to see. We saw overall energy finance, this kind of bottom bar is 100%, but it represents 40.2 billion in total. And that meant that 13.4 billion went to clean energy, and was only a tiny bit higher than what went to fossil fuels at 11.5 billion. And of course, we're seeing here that the support for fossils grew a little bit by 2 billion from the last time period, which is again really alarming at a time when we should be seeing this like rapidly going to zero, and we should be seeing MDBs really lead the way. Yeah, and then we can go a little bit by bank, and these are the ones included in the slide above. One like silver lining, hopefully, on this is that we can see with the World Bank Group and the EIB, both of them have new policies that came in that will come into effect past the kind of 2016 to 2018 time period of this study. Part of the lag in this is just because the way we're able to collect data, a lot of the reporting is still really delayed, even from the even from MDBs who have tend to have a little bit clearer reporting than some of the other international public finance institutions that we include in this study. But even with them, there's a lot that's unclear, and it's often quite lagged. And so it's frustrating, I think, especially at a time like this when we have a lot of really key and kind of very game-changing crises unfolding. This, like looking at data from 2018, feels like a bit of a photograph of a racing car. But I think it's still useful to know that, yeah, this is the closest we can get of knowing kind of like what direction they're heading in broadly. So with the World Bank Group, their policy past 2019 is for no upstream oil and gas. So definitely not to say that this bar would be going, this bar could stay the same if they're just shifting that finance to oil and gas at other parts of the supply chain, but likely to go down. And with the EIB, they had introduced their energy lending policy last fall that excludes finance for oil and almost all gas, with some exceptions. And so we would also see the kind of second place bank here hopefully also go down quite a bit in the next time period. But going a little bit deeper, and I think just to say this, I wanted to kind of show that this data is available in the report, but I won't be going through it in a lot of detail because it's a lot of numbers to throw at people. But just to highlight, we saw, really big changes in the level of oil and gas finance between the 2 time periods for the 3 largest energy financiers here. And so, highlighted those in the red box there. So seeing the World Bank Group and the Asian Development Bank greatly expand their oil and gas finance, and the EIB go in the other direction. And I think kind of overall, we saw clean energy climb, but it wasn't concentrated in any really dramatic changes in any one bank. And so we saw most banks across the board increase their clean energy finance by a little bit. And then continuing just with the other banks, and this was sorted by how much energy finance each bank had, also saw the Islamic Development Bank really spike their oil and gas finance in this time period. And yeah, I think just to say overall, in terms of the distribution of finance, the Islamic Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank had the highest overall portion of finance for fossil fuels. And then the New Development Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development had the highest proportion for clean energy. So just going forward, I think there's like really big caveats to this data that are frustrating and I think really important to highlight in terms of advocacy and trying to encourage banks to have better reporting on this. So the first would be associated infrastructure. And so even as we've seen a lot of banks introduce policies to exclude coal, there's other ways that coal finance has continued. And I think we'll see the same thing for oil and gas as more exclusions for that kind of fossil fuel kind of roll in. And so the first is associated infrastructure. That's, for example, building a train line that will primarily carry coal that's needed for the plant to for the plant or mine or facility to operate. And so yeah, that is included in some kinds of exclusion policies, but is often a big loophole. The second being through financial intermediaries. And so that typically is really hard to track and can be a really large portion of an MDB's finance. And then thirdly, through kind of policy-based lending, where it's changing policies in a way that helps encourage more fossil fuel extraction or otherwise kind of help encourage oil, gas, or coal. And so all three of these tend to be pretty hard to track and not included in the data that we're able to present. And so yeah, just giving a really quick overview of what's happened so far in these kind of last few months. I think just to say, and Dileimy and Andrew will be talking about this a lot more, but just to say overall, I think it does make this moment makes it really clear that a just transition is needed more than ever. I think particularly countries that are really dependent on oil and gas right now. I think this moment has really highlighted the volatility and the need to ensure that we're using MDBs and other finance that's available to help start a just transition and not leave workers and communities behind. I think when it's just the markets, you tend to see a lot of gaps, and it's not necessarily like, I think the idea that the oil price, that oil crashing has kind of silver linings for the climate isn't true if we're not helping that transition along and making sure that people aren't left behind by it. And so just to say, in terms of the responses so far, there's definitely not a lot of clarity yet, which makes sense. People are definitely in the kind of, especially in terms of what is publicly available and what we know about finance so far, it does feel like we're mostly in the first phase of like first responding to this crisis still. There's new finance and accelerated lending pledged in response across the board, but obviously in terms of how that translates to changes in energy finance flows other than being larger is still unclear. And there's some commitments and movement towards more debt relief in this moment, which is, I think, really key for just transition and a lot of just recovery priorities we'd hope to see. But the granularity isn't there. And in terms of the G20 commitment, at least, I think it doesn't seem large enough to, really make, really help in terms of the current size of the debt burden and kind of the historical context. And so I think definitely following the work of the Debt Jubilee Coalition on that is helpful, and would really recommend people go follow that aspect of this, even though it's not directly climate related. And then just to highlight, there's definitely been lots of kind of blog posts or statements from different officials that different banks are hoping to prioritize a green recovery, but that's definitely, I think, with the exception of the EIB, where it was their president saying it, it's not necessarily like officially in policy yet. And so we're also seeing not necessarily clear messaging from like all parts of every bank so far. And so one example of this was from the World Bank, where on the right-hand side, we've seen a couple of really strong blog posts with strong principles for a sustainable just recovery. But then we've also seen the World Bank President, David Malpass, referencing structural reforms and structural adjustment programs of the past. And so, which had, yeah, I think as history has shown time and time again, has had really detrimental and horrific impacts for countries. And so to even kind of foreshadow that in an official statement, I think felt very dramatic. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely been signaling in the right direction for COVID-19 in terms of response, but I think yeah, hoping to get a lot more clarity, and I think yeah, awaiting kind of stronger commitments from the banks to really commit to a just and sustainable recovery. And I'll end off there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Bronwen. That was really interesting. It's actually, I had some questions, but we've actually got some interesting questions which have come in. So I thought we'll maybe try and answer them now because the presentation is still fresh. So someone's asked, what coal finance still exists? And do we know which MDBs and when they've been improved are any in pipelines?
Yeah, so in terms of 2016 to 2018, the only coal finance that we had on the books, and so I think just to say like that's where some of the kind of loopholes that I mentioned really come in, where I think there is strong suggestion that there's still coal finance through some of those more indirect channels, but we had found some development policy lending from the World Bank in terms of policies to support coal mining. And so definitely in those development policy loans, there's not a ton of detail about what kind of support was or what kind of advice or kinds of policies were developed in most cases. And so yeah, unfortunately don't have a ton of detail on in terms of the impact that finance would have had. And it was 41 million. And so, yeah, not necessarily a large amount at this point. There are still a handful of banks that do not have coal exclusion policies, and so could finance coal again in the future. But it was definitely promising to not see almost all of it go down to zero in the 3 years that we have. That's the most recent time period.
Okay, I'll just ask one more. Do you have disaggregated data for the World Bank Group? So how much was sent by the public sector arm and how much by the private sector arm?
So we do have that data. It wasn't broken down like that in terms of this report, just because we were trying to cover so much ground. And so that's something, the database that's behind this report is called the Shift the Subsidies database. And we are able to send different cuts of that data for researchers. And so I can definitely send that on. And as the other presenters talk, I'll see if I can kind of fetch that statistic and send it in the chat.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, just keep your questions coming. And if anybody wants to clarify their questions at the end of all the presentations, please feel free. So next to speak, we have Dileimy Orozco. She's a policy advisor on international climate finance at E3G, which is based in London. Her work is focused on systemic reforms of the financial system at both the private and public level, working both to green existing financial institutions and developing the framework for creating ambitious financial institutions to deliver the finance required to drive a low carbon resilient economy. Thank you, Dileimy.
Hi, thank you. Just give me a second to share my screen. So yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to share my thoughts on the key role MDBs are going to play in making sure this crisis is going to result in building back better. So in order to do this, I think it's going to be valuable that we'll split the crisis response into different phases. And the action impacts MDBs are going to have in each of them. But before I do that, for those that don't know E3G, we're a European environmental think tank. We work at the global level. We have offices in Brussels, Berlin, London, and DC. We focus on analyzing, shaping national and international policy of climate change. We have experts on diplomacy, security, finance, clean economy, and resilience. And our funding mostly comes from philanthropic and government. So as I mentioned before, it is useful to break the COVID response into 3 stages. If we think about the first stage where we are now, the focus is on trying to stop the economic heart attack and also ensure health systems are going to be able to handle the crisis. Then when we move forward to the second phase, we shift to try to stimulate the economy, and countries are going to start coming up with infrastructure plans and more targeted fiscal response. However, we see that the third phase is going to be fundamental because this is where we're going to give the opportunity to think more widely about the structure of the future economic governance, but also the social investment. And the ability to mainstream climate into the COVID crisis response, as I said, will vary with the phases of the crisis. So this space will be different as we move forward. So currently we're in the stabilization phase. Most countries and MDBs at the moment, and rightly so, are just focusing on reorientating their activities and targeting the health crisis. What we have seen, I think Bronwen mentioned this before, is that MDBs have responded adaptive very quickly. They have ramped up the emergency funding, and in general, they have demonstrated their capacity to adapt and provide counter-cyclical response. However, we're seeing a lot of, at the same time, we're seeing a lot of pressure to get money out of the door, but the quality of investment shouldn't be compromised. For example, if we think about the spending that has been done on building health facilities, this should be leading to a more resilient health system. Well, one way of doing this is by integrating energy efficiency, but also cooling systems. We have to think, for example, in the case of delivering the vaccine, we have some of the development banks financing research, but no one is paying attention on the delivery of this. And we know that the cold chain system is broken, particularly in developing countries. Because remember, this is a global crisis, and then no country will be truly safe until the other ones are also. So the actions taken in the next 18, 20 to 24 months will define the economy for years. So we're going to see, as I mentioned before, that the next 3 to 6 months, countries are going to start drafting stimulus packages to stimulate the economy. And this is going to be mostly focused by infrastructure. So these investments are going to be determined the climate action for the next 5 to 10 years. So the design and the conditions of COVID recovery packages are essential. So this is going to be a decisive moment in terms of achieving the Paris goals, and this stimulus must be green. And let's not forget that in 2018, there was a lot of noise about green recovery, but actually 12% of it was green. So what MDBs could be doing at this right now? So there could be a way for them to promote better outcome for sustainability and resilient recovery. One way of doing it is by including ability to fast track projects which can contribute to the Paris alignment. for example, by creating a Paris alignment stamp, promote transparency about the disbursement of funding, and this is going to be particularly crucial when it comes to financial intermediaries. Also, we know they can play a role as investors of first resort. What I mean about this, they could have a more proactive role in building the green project pipeline. In the medium term, it seems a bit odd to think about this in the middle of a crisis, health crisis, but in the medium term, these green projects will have significant potential to crowd in private sector capital and to stimulate the economy. Also, they should help, they could help countries to see that the investment in green projects can lead to a large number of jobs. And why does this is the case? They can be labor intensive and they are more sustainable in the long term. And what's more importantly, they can be implemented swiftly. So they are shovel-ready projects. But this is not going to be enough. And this is why the third stage, we need to think about what the third phase is. Because greening the stimulus won't have an impact without a long-term plan. We have seen this before in 2008 with the financial crisis, that the green stimulus was unsupported by structural changes and will not lead to the desirable result. MDBs can play a key role as providers of technical assistance, as we know, and also thought leadership. They can support countries to develop their long-term strategy to move onto a more sustainable development pathway. And why this is important? This is going to provide the economy with a vision of what a carbon-free future is. It will help them to identify the investment and manage the trade-off involved. And what I mean about this, we're talking about just transition as well. Also, they will be able to draft their policies and institutional reforms required across the economy and at a sectoral level. And this could help to ensure NDC's ambitions increase. This will empower countries to own their long-term strategies and in turn inform financing investment strategy as well. This will be a way for them to actually, as they always say, they are demand-led. So this is a way for them to help countries demand the projects they want to see. So this also will help identify and access required external financial and technical assistance from different international funds, not only the multilateral development banks, but also it will empower countries to make better use of the public and private sector finance nationally. And well, I should mention as well that we have done a bit of work around the international financial institutions. So if you want to read a bit more about this, this is a bit of a sample of the work we have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dileimy. I'm just checking if we have any questions for you. So yeah, we have one. I think we should just take that now. Has the World Bank or other MDBs defined structural reforms, or are we assuming they look like old SALs, privatization, etc.?
Well, I'm not necessarily talking about privatization, but if we think that a lot of countries are going to, in any case, going to need support from these MDBs, what we need to ensure is if countries have already certain plans, they are green, how we can demonstrate that these are potential vehicles to make it into a more clear green pipeline. And this is where the gap is. So this is not about privatization. This is not about looking what happened before and the failures of the structural reforms that happened previously. This is about how we ensure that whatever is going to happen from now on in terms of fiscal stimulus, instead of changing in the institutional level, which is going to come, is going to have the long-lasting effect that we need. That happened, we have seen, didn't come specifically from the MDBs, but we did see it in 2008, some regulation, different type of regulations. They didn't they were short-lived. And in other cases, like in the banking sector, they're still shaping the banking sector. So how we can ensure everything is done at this moment? How can we ensure the is actually delivering for the future economy we want to see?
Okay, thanks. And we do have another question, but I think we should maybe wait to the end. There's also another question for Oil Change International. Thanks, guys, for the questions, but I'll move on for now. So the next speaker we have is Augustine Njamnsh. I'm sorry if I pronounce your surname wrong. Correct me if I have. He's the coordinator for the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access. Augustine has been a lawyer with 25 years of environmental policy and governance advocacy in Cameroon and the Central African sub-region. His experience includes legislative and policy drafting in the areas of access to genetic resources and benefit sharing, biosafety, biosecurity, access to environmental information, and public participation in decision making. Thank you, Augustine.
Thank you so much. I lost network connection just when you were introducing me, but I know how you introduced me. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'll just have my points at the level of strategic thinking, and I will be very qualitative in my intervention. I have 3 points. The first point is that COVID-19 experience in Africa has made the case for a decentralized, participatory, renewable energy plus the role of civil society in Africa more compelling. Why do I say so? Firstly, COVID-19 has only come to compound an already bad health situation that we've been facing in Africa. You know, a majority of households on the continent use fuel woods, and they have this stone cooking firesides that they have been using for over centuries and have been inhaling the carbon monoxide that comes from the burning of the fuel wood, and so have had some long issues. And we know that COVID-19 has to do with lungs. So if it has to deal with this rural population, especially women that do the cooking, that have already been predisposed to these lung infections or lung problems, COVID-19 has only come to compound that situation. Secondly, COVID-19 patients are dying in the continent mostly because of lack of energy in most health centers that are found in rural areas. And even in cities, there is power outage that is rampant in most cities, and most of the time, the health centers or the health units are not functioning 100% because of unreliable energy. Thirdly, response measures such as lockdown has exposed the day-to-day and hand-to-mouth subsistence way of life that have been in place because of lack of food storage facilities, making life even much more difficult. You know, a majority of African households, even those who are living in the city, the low-income people, go to the market on a daily basis to fend for what they will eat on a particular day. So when there is lockdown, they are not able to do so because they don't even have storage facilities. If they had the means to stock food, they would not also have how to stock it because of lack of energy for cooling systems. Decentralized participatory energy systems guarantees not only security, but can also create jobs for the local communities. Imagine a community that is in an isolated area where there are these solar farms that is generating the energy for that community. The likelihood that the the youth of that community will have jobs in this industry will be higher. So I think COVID-19 has proven that we need such things in the local areas. Then again, the drop in oil prices will negatively impact those oil-dependent economies of Africa, hence exposing the volatile nature of the fossil-based economies. Because of COVID-19, the oil prices have gone down, and drastically so. So the economies of Africa, or most African economies that are dependent on oil or fossil fuels, are also facing those challenges. So the budgets will be reduced and many other things will come up. The second major point I would like to state here is that aligning investment in Africa with the Paris Agreement is very critical because COVID-19 has only come to compound the effects of climate change, which are ever increasing. We should also remember that COVID-19 has not put a hold on the devastating effects of climate change that have already affected Africa in a big way. So issues like reduction in food production due to climate conditions have been aggravated by COVID-19 and the firefighting measures that have accompanied that. It is even projected that a low-cost invasion in East Africa will be threefold more than what they had last year, and the situation is not getting any better. We know that most of the countries of East Africa had this invasion of desert locusts that devastated crops and livelihoods of whole communities in that area. So it is projected that it will continue to happen. So there is a need to change the way we are investing and how we're investing, especially in this energy sector. Again, somebody has already mentioned, NDCs are very important. Nearly all African countries that contributed, put their NDCs on the table, have renewable energy as part of the NDCs. So aligning it with Paris Agreement, aligning investment with Paris Agreement in this area is only going to help those countries meet their NDC commitments. Thirdly, the effective participation of stakeholders in recovery decision-making at all levels is a sine qua non for its success. Here I'm talking of the level where Dileimy called the structural future economic governance and social investment stage. You know, we can count a number of initiatives, especially on renewable energy, that have taken place in Africa and continue to take place. But what is generally lacking is the lack of participation or inadequate participation of the stakeholders. If investment in renewable energy is to alleviate poverty, is to build up economic recovery and fight poverty amongst the communities, it is very, very important for these communities to be part of decision making. Governance, good governance, not only being the adequacy of a final decision, but also the process through which the decision has been arrived at is very, very important. So if we have to succeed on this continent called Africa, it is high time we involve the people we think we are, protecting or you are promoting in the decision making. Because when you do quick fixing in every situation, most of the time it ends up as a disaster. When the promoter is away, it drops, everything drops. So good governance, participation of stakeholders is very, very important for it to have the good final decision. We also have examples of renewable energy schemes on the continent that have turned out to be of a great disservice to the local population. We have communities where there have been solar energy projects, big mega solar energy projects, that the communities have come complaining that they don't even have water again to water their crops. This is a very good intention. The issue of having renewable energy is good. It is from all angles the best thing to happen. But it should be done with the participation of the people so that some of these issues can be sorted out from the onset. Then finally, sustainability of projects is guaranteed only and when the stakeholders are part of the decision making at all stages. So I will stop here and just say COVID-19 is an eye-opener for the continent, and we think we have to change the way of investing in the continent, and that should be with the participation of the stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Augustine. That was a very thought-provoking speech. We've got some more questions. I know some people want to clarify some questions live, so we'll do that once everybody's spoken. But Augustine, this question was asked while you were speaking. So the question is, could debt swaps be replaced by climate lending in a way that would enhance sustainable self-development instead of loss of sovereignty?
Come again, please.
Could debt swaps be replaced by climate lending in a way that would enhance sustainable self-development instead of loss of sovereignty?
Question of sovereignty has always been very, very critical for the continent. There has to be a balance between the two, because once the people have lost the right to take decisions and they are dependent on the decisions of the lenders or those who are helping them, most of the time it fails. And the accountability only comes when sovereign people are taking decisions and have the opportunity to hold the governments accountable for whatever they have taken or whatever decision they have taken, if it is in the interest of the people.
Okay, thank you.
I can hear you.
Thank you, Augustine, sorry. So the final speaker we have is Andrew Scott, who is Director of Programme Climate and Energy at the Overseas Development Institute. Andrew's main research interests are energy access for poverty reduction and the role of energy in sustainable livelihoods and in the transition to low carbon development pathways. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Vibeka, and the opportunity to talk to everybody today. My remarks are going to focus on the energy sector broadly in the context of greening the post-pandemic recovery. Many of you will already know that public polling is showing that there's a lot of public support for recovery programs that address the climate emergency. And there's a lot of high-level public support from policymakers as well. But we don't yet know how many governments will respond to this when they formulate their recovery programs. I think it's too soon to know the full impact of the pandemic and the impact of the curtailment of economic activity that's followed. And it's too soon to know how this is going to vary between regions and countries. What we do know is that millions of people have lost their job or suffered a reduction in income. And we know that low-income, vulnerable and socially marginalized groups have been impacted the most, the same people who are most at risk to the impacts of climate change. It's also too soon to know the shape and scale of the recovery measures that governments will use to revitalize their economies. Looking from the previous presentations, it's clear that there are stages in this process, and we're still at the moment only in the first response stage and not yet in the recovery stage. But we do know that when recovery measures are formulated and implemented, they may have long-term consequences for the climate and sustainable development. But because they have resulted from an unprecedented but not unpredicted pandemic, there's no reason for governments or international organizations to ignore the long-term effects of recovery measures, despite the immediacy and urgency of recovery. And there's no reason for governments to overlook their national and international commitments to address the climate emergency. As Augustine has said, the climate crisis has not gone away or been made any less urgent by the fact that there's going to be a small reduction in greenhouse gas emissions this year. and the imperative to phase out the use of fossil fuel remains. A key question for those preparing recovery measures, whether they be governments or multilateral development banks supporting them, is how risks and choose between measures that have or do not have adverse impacts for climate change or resilience to climate change. I think we need to avoid measures that would lock in future greenhouse gas emissions or result in stranded assets. And we might want to go further and ask recovery measures to be assessed about whether or not they accelerate climate action, given the immediacy and urgency for that action to take place. Also, governments and the multilateral development banks and international organizations need to be transparent about their assessments of the climate implications of their recovery measures. We need to see how those climate risks have been assessed. In the energy sector, we can see two immediate effects of the COVID pandemic: reduced energy consumption and reduced investment. The International Energy Agency estimates oil consumption globally will be 9% lower in 2020 than the previous year, and gas consumption will be 5% lower. The reduction in electricity consumption is also going to be of the same order. The effect on energy consumption will clearly vary between countries, and we still don't have detailed information on what those effects have been or going to be. But it's reasonable to assume part of this reduction is due to less economic activity, and part is due to residential consumers consuming less. In many, very high share of the total. For low-income consumers, including the newly unemployed and the newly lower income, this may be because they can no longer afford basic modern energy services. For these consumers, social assistance measures may be an effective way to enable continued access to energy, and that may need to be part of the recovery phase as well as the response phase. At the investment side of the equation, the effects of renewable energy investment need to be considered separately, I think. In the case of renewable energy investment, the International Energy Agency notes that in 2020, we'll see a 6% increase in installed capacity of renewable energy power. There's going to be an increase, but the rate of increase will be lower. This slower rate of growth is largely in the areas of solar and wind power, but these are also the forms of power that are faster and cheaper to install. Solar photovoltaics in the off-grid market also have a short lead time. And with the right measures to support value change, solar and wind could recover very quickly. Investment in the oil is something else, and is forecast by the International Energy Agency to fall by about 1/3 in 2020. But the COVID pandemic is not the only. The sector was already facing slowing demand and intense competition between suppliers. The resultant fall in prices makes oil and gas investment in some countries unattractive now. And in some places, it may make current production uneconomic. While the oil and gas industry has lobbied for support in response to the pandemic, this is support in addition to the $50 billion a year subsidy that G20 countries already give to the sector. Post-pandemic recovery measures to support the oil and gas industry could be questionable both from economic and climate change perspectives. Historically, investment in oil and gas production has not necessarily led to faster economic growth than investment in other sectors. And we know it leads to fewer jobs than investment in renewable energy. The current state of the oil market means that price volatility remains a threat for high-cost producers, and global demand is anyway expected to level off and decline within a few years. The imperative of rapid and steep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to avert catastrophic climate change suggests that we, and national governments and multilateral development banks should seek to use recovery measures as a way to accelerate the phasing out of oil and gas production. The details of all of this have yet to be worked out, but now is the time to start having the debate about it. I'll stop you there and look forward to more questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So now we can get to questions. There's one for you, Andrew, so I'll start with you because you've just finished your presentation. Any thoughts on arguments made by MDBs that investment in gas is needed for baseload in African countries? Is this an anachronistic argument from your point of view?
Yes, is the simple answer. I don't think that we necessarily need to invest in gas or other fossil fuels as a base load. Part of the argument here is that you need something like oil and gas to provide a quick response to fluctuations in demand, but that can also be handled, you see very clearly in the UK already, by a diverse renewable power sector. Also, I think what's worth noting is that the most efficient gas power stations are not the ones that are quick response ones. So even if you were going to use oil and gas as a form of balancing load, you need to use the more inefficient versions. So the simple answer is I think it's an anachronistic argument. It doesn't take into account the modern technologies that are available to use renewable power as a way to balance loads.
Okay, thank you. And I may need Sophie or Bronwen to help me. We've got someone who wants to answer a question live. So I don't know if we can do that quickly. If not, I'll answer a question in the meantime.
Sorry, yes, I think I pressed out by mistake. But one thing about the World Bank and how they define the structural reforms, I think that I'm not talking about the MDBs to come and implement structural reforms on what they think is best. I'm saying that the MDBs should help countries design their own long-term strategies, and for the countries based on their own long-term strategies, decide what's best, and then best in terms of what policy institutional decide they need to establish in country, and ask for support in terms of finance and technical assistance, not only from the MDBs, but also other climate funds. That's what I meant. So that's very different from saying that the World Bank is going to come and implement the structural reforms. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I hope that's clarification. If not, please ask further questions in the Q&A box, but I think that's answered now, it sounds like. Thank you. So we've got a question for everyone. So anybody pitch in on this. What are thoughts on where a global Green New Deal, as called for by UNCTAD last year, fits into this discussion, especially with respect for mobilising further grant financing for climate action in LICs, where efforts to crowd in private finance have so far had limited success? Does anybody want to jump in on that question?
I can start just to say that I think definitely taking a step back and having a broader political context for this question is really critical. And so definitely the amount of climate finance that has been pledged is far below what would be needed, or what any kind of metric for fair shares in terms of the burden of climate change and historical responsibility. And definitely with, in terms of also thinking about how the kinds of shifts in political economy that we would need to see to really get to that place where we are at a fair share, it does feel like definitely starting to socialize a global Green New Deal and at the MDB level would be helpful. I think to me, it feels like something that needs to be worked into kind of national political conversations as well, in making that link. And so I think definitely, so in my perspective, I'm here in Canada, and we do have a strong discourse around a Green New Deal here, but it is overwhelmingly still domestic focused. And so I think that would be a really big mistake, and wouldn't have just outcomes if countries are implementing Green New Deals, but not thinking about the global equity aspects of it. And so, yeah, needing to also think, needing to make sure that those, all the different Green New Deal campaigns happening in different places are also thinking about global justice and really putting an emphasis on it, so that there is an impetus from the governments that are shareholders at MDBs to increase finance and also do so in a way that doesn't increase debt or further kind of escalate inequalities. So yeah, I think just in short, it's an important one, and I think just needs to be pushed for at a bunch of different levels for it to happen successfully.
Okay, thank you. So does anybody want to jump in on that, how a global Green New Deal fits into this discussion? If not, we can move on to
I'll give a quick response from my perspective. I think there are a couple of challenges, I think, for a dialogue and the development of a global Green New Deal. One is that most of the thinking about Green New Deals has been very North American and Euro-eccentric, and it doesn't necessarily, and they don't necessarily take into account the situation of countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia and Latin America. Secondly, I think I struggle to see why we should be labeling what we should be doing anyway as a Green New Deal. Because we're in this post-pandemic situation, and northern governments are thinking about how they're going to recover and whether that can be green or not, most other countries in the world are trying to develop further. And they need investment and support to be able to do that. And that investment and support, pandemic or no pandemic, should be about long-term development and long-term sustainability. So I think it's a convenient phrase, but I'm not sure it's going to catch the attention of all governments in the world. Final point on this one is I see very little international cooperation and dialogue taking place around post-pandemic recoveries. At the moment, it's mostly national governments doing their own thing, with maybe some financial support from the Multilateral Development Banks. But there seems to be at the moment no great rush for governments to come together and cooperate for a global recovery program as opposed to national recovery programs.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So I'll move on to another question. I think this is also for all panelists. The MDBs are also implementers in climate funds. What should they do different in their interaction with climate funds going forward, if anything? For example, focusing on integration of social system support in climate projects. Does anybody want to take that on? I'm not sure who would be most relevant. Or I'll pick somebody if everybody's shy. Augustine, do you want to take on that question? I think that's a no. Okay, we'll come back to that. Maybe if we look in the Q&A box, if panelists need more time to think of it. I'll go into another question. Okay, Augustine?
What was the question, please? I was looking for it in the question box and I didn't see it.
No, it's fine. It's at the top. So the question is, The MDBs are also implementers in climate funds. What should they do different in their interaction with climate funds going forward, if anything? For example, focusing on integration of social system support in climate projects.
Yeah, you know, we have in the climate arena, we've fought, sometimes we've fought before to say that these MDBs should be even off by climate finance. Reason being that we've seen in the past that most of the time, the decision making is hardly based on what the people need. With non-investment projects that people have protested in countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and at the end of the day, you still see those projects going on without these social considerations or the environmental safeguards, social and environmental safeguards being taken into consideration. Climate change being a disaster, climate change being an emergency for countries in Africa, we thought that the discourse, the modus operandi of the way climate change is being attacked or being solved should not be in the hands of the traditional way of doing business or business as usual of the MDBs. So if MDBs are, as they are, involved in climate finance, they should make sure that it has a different way of doing things, because climate change is peculiar. And you know, there are many questions of equity and justice in this climate business. If we know that climate change has been caused by the way of life, the development models that have been in the North for over several centuries, that has put us where we are. The equity question we always ask, if you set fire to my house, will you give me a loan to rebuild it? Or will you sell me the fire extinguisher to put off the fire? Those are some of the questions. The way MDBs have been operating, they take profit into consideration, they take value returns on their investment into consideration, but this cannot wholly go into climate into the climate arena, the way of doing things. Knowing fully well that those who are victims of climate change, those who are at the forefront, at the front line of the impacts of climate change, are those people that are not even able to be seen in the public space. They are suffering silently. So if we are doing business or climate funds, we should handle them in a way that reflects these peculiarities of the climate problem. So I think MDBs should be there, but the modus operandi should be adapted to the real problem, which is the problem of adaptation and mitigation and subsistence amongst the vulnerable people at the front line. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Augustine. So the next question I'm going to ask is quite long, so maybe panelists also want to look at this question in the Q&A box. So the question is from Christian Donaldson, and he asks, as you know, MDBs are not monolithic institutions. Most MDBs' governance and decision-making is structured around the interests of their country members. On issues related to energy paths, usually there is a divide between donor countries and borrower countries. And the demand for fossil fuel investments usually come from developing countries. So how can we overcome that challenge, convince developing countries to demand the type of projects we want? What is the role of MDBs in terms of sovereignty? Just lost the end of that question, sorry. Okay, that question's disappeared on my screen. So that's,
if you like,
okay,
I think it's just gone up towards the top.
I found it, yes, thank you.
No worries.
So just at the end, so what is the role of MDBs in terms of countries' sovereignty, client-driven as they usually put it?
Can I say something here?
Okay.
Yeah, I think this issue of business based on demand of the client countries has been used as a password to continue to fund dirty energy. I must state it here. It is since 1635 that the countries realized that fossil fuel will be causing us problems. Banks have not ceased to invest in such. It is not like they did not know. You see, if somebody comes to the market and is demanding for something that you don't have, they will not demand for it, okay? If the MDBs mean well, and they want to change the traction or the path that we are taking in investment on to solve the climate crisis, they also have a role to play. If a child comes to you and asks for cigarettes, will you just give them the cigarettes to smoke just because it's what they're asking for? This is just a password to postpone action. I think we have to call out these MDBs and say it is not that sovereignty that you are relying on is based on what you encourage them to do. No country will want to invest in something that will be obsolete in the next couple of years. But it's because when you make it available, when you say it's easier to have this, they will always ask for it. These are politics that we should frown at as civil society. It is a password to postpone action, and we cannot buy that again. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Augustine. Bronwen, I think this is an area where you may have some interesting views as well, because you've done interesting research into MDBs and their financing of energy.
Yeah, maybe just to add a little, I think, yeah, I definitely agree with Augustine, and there's, I think, a lot of cases of looking at the MDBs and still, or the countries that govern them, and still seeing, encouragement to, in a lot of different ways, to continue building fossil fuel projects. And so looking at the case of Guyana and the World Bank in the past few years is one example where I think is useful to look at. You can look at Japan, and this is partially through the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Investment, the AIIB, but there's lots of cases of Japan giving advice or offering kind of development policy and technical advice on countries' energy plans, and then really building coal into those models and into the advice that they're giving. And so I think just pushing back a little bit on the assumption that the ask is always coming from developing countries. And also just to say, I think it's a case of, I think the burden is really on wealthy countries with the historic responsibility to increase their climate finance and increase the amount that's being given, in concessional portions and in grants, and without, strong strings attached, but really at least having the money available for there to be lots of other attractive options. I think that's I think it's incumbent on those countries as well to do a better job.
Does anybody else want to?
Yes, I would like to add something. I think that's very important what Bronwen mentioned about Japan and the role has had in terms of drafting energy policies in certain countries, in developing countries, and that was the case in Mozambique and other places. So one thing I feel that there is a massive gap at the moment within the MDBs and the technical assistance they provide is how to help countries to draft their own long-term strategies. I go back to this because this could open the conversations at the different levels within different ministry, but also they should be complemented with getting academics and also think tanks in countries that are specialized on these issues or learn on how to do it. this is the IDB, as far as I understand, is the only one doing this thing, and that opened up the conversation in Costa Rica, where there is a long-term decarbonization plan, and now they're thinking about a national finance strategy, not only for climate, but for the whole economy. So this is a way of getting rid of the gap that exists, and not only talk about client-driven response.
Okay, thank you, Dileimy. So the next question is about regulation. So how can MDBs scale up and drive the climate finance funds to inject equity liquidity by funding higher risk projects? What are the two specific regulatory measures that should be in place to drive this demand? And the question tails off there, but I think, yeah, the question is about climate finance funds and equity liquidity and what specific regulatory measures are needed. I think, Dileimy, that might be a good one for you to answer with your background in policy.
I'm not especially on climate finance funds. I think that's something we don't look into much detail. But I think one of the things, how can MDB specifically, I could say, talk about just only MDBs and not the broader climate finance funds, is to finance higher risk projects. One of the things we have noticed is there is this obsession with keeping the AAA rating. And there's a lot of work, for example, ODI and others have done around how to sweat the assets of the MDBs. So one way of doing it, and they're going to need some support from the shareholders, is that they could take more risk and potentially go into AA+ rating, which is still pretty good if you think, if you compare with commercial banks. So that could be another way. The other thing I feel that hasn't been talked too much yet is that the new finance is going to be needed for countries. It's going to also require some support coming from shareholders. Is around capitalization. That's going to be needed, and maybe not today, but in the 6-8 months come, is going to need it for the recovery of certain countries. If we're seeing that more than 100 countries are already approaching the World Bank for support. But maybe others can talk a bit more specifically on the other climate finance funds.
Okay, thank you, Dileimy. So yeah, does anybody want to pitch in on the question about scaling up climate finance funds?
Just one word on that. I mean, I think Dileimy's right that there will be, given the situation of the next 2 or 3 years, there will be a need for the multilateral development banks to think about whether or not they need more capital from their member governments. And there have also been calls for special measures like special drawing rights to enable more funds to be able to flow to low and middle income countries. But it's also worth reminding ourselves that the donor governments, the rich countries, promised 100 billion a year of climate finance 10 years ago. That hasn't materialized. And so if we continue to ask for scaling up climate finance, we're actually only asking governments to do what they said they were going to do a long time ago. And I think now is the time for low-income and middle-income countries to continue to press home that point, and say that we need this transition. I think Dileimy is also right that in the previous comment that multilateral development banks and bilateral donors have a role to play to enable recipient countries to develop their own strategies for transitions to low-carbon development strategies and long-term strategies. This is the year when all countries are supposed to be submitting to the UNFCCC their long-term strategy for looking towards the middle of the century and how that country expects to achieve something close to a net zero outcome in the middle of the the century. Very few countries will probably put that in now, and those that do will probably only do it in a very outlined kind of way. Even the national determined contributions that were submitted 5 years ago and are now to be resubmitted this year, very few countries have a concrete plan on how to implement those nationally determined contributions, including many rich countries. So I think on the one hand, many countries have an idea of what they want financed. They also have provided an indication of what that finance needs to be. The real challenge now is to get that both action on climate change and action to get us back from the pandemic recovery.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So we're getting nearer to the end of the webinar. So I think we should end with each panelist giving a sentence and what they think will move the needle on MDBs and the need for a Paris-aligned just recovery. As I said at the beginning, I'm quite new to public finance, and I was pretty shocked about the levels of fossil fuel investment that is still happening, considering the climate crisis that we're in. So it'd be great for each of you just to give a sentence on what you think will move the needle on this. Thanks. So we'll start with Bronwen.
I'm so sorry, but you cut out during the question. If you could repeat it.
Yeah, I just want each panelist to give a sentence on what they think will move the needle on MDBs and this need for Paris-aligned just recovery. Thanks.
For sure. Yeah, I think for me, the thing that feels like it would be the biggest sea change is like looking at the countries who are governing the banks right now. I think there is a lot of, it very much feels like we're at this moment where things will change, and things will, I think there's kind of a bigger dichotomy and divergence in the paths that different governments are taking. But it does feel like there is, so both the potential for things to get a lot worse, especially in this moment of crisis, depending on who is trying to take opportunity of it for their own profits and how successful they are. But it does also feel like there's the opportunity for things to get a lot better. So I think for me, it's hoping and pushing for the governments at the top of the MDBs to change and really prioritize climate justice.
Okay, thank you. And Dileimy, what do you think is needed to move the needle on this subject?
Well, I feel that it will be crucial, the international cooperation. I think that's going to be a determinant. We haven't seen that yet. We have yet to see the coordinated responses that we saw in 2008. There isn't a mandate yet for the MDBs to help countries to stimulate the economy yet. So I hope that will come up soon. And the other thing is that they shouldn't be also looking at the MDBs, but more widely, the international financial institutions. Because let's remember that public finance is not the MDBs, but also export credit agencies, development financial institutions, bilateral and national development banks. So I think that will need to be from the G20, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Dileimy. And Augustine, what do you think is needed to move the needle?
Thank you. I think the COVID-19 has taught us a lesson, and we cannot continue to do business as usual. When it happens, it can start from anywhere. I tweeted at the mid of March saying that the ship has started sinking from the top, meaning that COVID-19, unlike Ebola and other ailments, started affecting people in the Northern Hemisphere before coming down here. We only have to be remorseful and know that we need each other on this globe called Mother Earth. It is not profit that will help us. It is humanity. And I think the MDBs are made of people, are made for people, and if they have to be some kind of solidarity on earth, it is for the good of everyone. So we don't need to do a lot of convincing. I think every other person is feeling the pinch of COVID-19. And this also shows that the climate crisis, even is affecting the developing countries more for now, it will end up reaching everywhere. And this COVID-19 is just a window to show us what the future looks like if we don't take decisions that are based on what is for the interest of Mother Earth and every other person. That said, I think Africa is in a better position to focus their development pathway on that path of cleanliness, because that's the path for the future. Not just because they want to solve the climate crisis or they want to contribute to solving the climate crisis, it's also for our own good. The good of our communities, the good of our people, and that is the way to go. And we should not over-focus on MDBs only. As we saw from some of the presentations, investment in Africa is not only in the hands of MDBs, it is in the hands of other organizations or institutions. It should become a culture of investing in what is useful and what is good for the health of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustine. And last but not least, Andrew, what do you think is needed to move the needle on multilateral development banks and a Paris-aligned just recovery? Thanks.
Thanks, Vibeka. I think a couple of points here. One is to remind both the multilateral development banks and others who are planning recovery measures, is that we don't really want to go back to where we were. The fault lines in society and economies in the past have been exposed by the pandemic, and we know that where we have come from was not a good place to be. Secondly, I think all the recovery measures need to be assessed from the point of view of their long-term impacts, both societal and environmental, and not just on the immediate short-term 18 months, 2-year type period that many recovery measures might be thinking about, because it's the long-term impacts and the long-term effects that are going to determine whether or not we end up with a sustainable society and tackle climate change. And then thirdly, I think that there's a lot more to be done in the realm of international cooperation and enabling countries and international organizations to work more closely together on these questions to come up with both the finance, but also the policy measures and policy advice to make it work.
Okay, thank you everybody. So I think this webinar is going to be recorded and available on the Big Shift website if you want to share it with colleagues, and it will also slides will be available, I think, afterwards if anybody wants to see them too. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.